The air in the P4 level of the underground garage was old and cold, smelling of damp concrete, forgotten oil spills, and the faint, metallic tang of exhaust fumes that never quite escaped to the world above. Frank sat in his glass-walled security booth, a small, warm island in an ocean of gray cement. The only sounds were the low-frequency hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water dripping from a pipe onto the stained floor of an empty parking bay. It was a sound that measured time in lonely increments. He'd worked this late shift for 7 years, and he knew the garage's quiet language. He knew the sigh of the ventilation system kicking in, the groan of the automatic gate, the distinct engine signatures of the few remaining tenants who kept late hours. Tonight, however, there was a new sound, or rather a new silence. For the past hour, a man had been sitting on a motorcycle in the bay, directly opposite the elevators. The bike was a monster, a hulking mass of black steel and chrome that seemed to absorb the weak light around it. The man was just as still, just as dark. Dressed in a tailored black leather jacket and dark jeans, he was a statue of coiled stillness. Frank couldn't see his face clearly, just the sharp line of his jaw and the way his dark hair was cut. He didn't move, he didn't check a phone. He just sat there, one boot planted firmly on the ground, radiating an aura of patience that felt more predatory than peaceful. Frank had seen men like him before. Men who moved with an unnerving economy of motion, whose presence altered the very atmosphere of a room. They were trouble usually, but this man did nothing. He just waited. And his waiting made the quiet garage feel charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Frank's job was to observe, report, and never, ever engage. He was a witness, not a hero. He adjusted the focus on the small black and white monitor, zooming in on the figure. The man's jacket was immaculate, the leather catching the overhead light in a dull sheen. He wore no helmet. He just sat, his gaze fixed on the brushed steel doors of the elevator, as if he knew exactly who, or what, he was waiting for. The sight made the back of Frank's neck prickle. It was a Tuesday night. Nothing ever happened on a Tuesday. The soft chime of the elevator arriving was abnormally loud in the concrete tomb. The steel doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and the silence was replaced by a new, softer sound. The whir of an electric motor and the gentle friction of rubber wheels on polished concrete. A young woman guided her wheelchair out into the garage. Frank leaned forward, his half-eaten sandwich forgotten. He recognized her. She worked in the graphic design firm on the 12th floor. A quiet woman who always offered a small, shy smile when she passed his booth in the main lobby. Tonight, she wore a vibrant red wool shirt, a splash of defiant color in the monochromatic world of P4. Her jeans were a faded blue, and a worn leather satchel was strapped to the back of her chair. Her name was Chloe. He knew that from the building directory. She navigated the chair with a practiced ease, her hands moving with a fluid grace. But Frank saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her head was on a constant, subtle swivel. No one liked being down here alone at night. The space was too vast, the shadows too deep. She was heading toward the section reserved for modified vehicles, a good 50 yards away. A long, lonely journey across the empty expanse. As she began her roll, Frank's eyes flickered from her to the man on the motorcycle. The man's head turned, a slow, deliberate motion. He was watching her. The intensity of his focus was a physical thing, a palpable pressure in the cold air. Frank felt his stomach tighten. This was it. This was the trouble he'd been sensing. He reached for the handset of the intercom, his fingers hovering over the button that would connect him to the main security desk upstairs. But what would he say? A man is looking at a woman? It wasn't a crime. It wasn't anything yet. He was just a witness, and so far, all he was witnessing was a silent, unnerving tableau. Chloe seemed to feel the weight of the man's gaze. She faltered for a second, her wheels slowing. She glanced over her shoulder, a quick, bird-like movement. She saw him. Frank saw the moment she registered his stillness, his size, the sheer, immovable presence of him. Her hands tightened on her wheels and she picked up her pace, her movements a little less fluid now, a little more urgent. The sound of her chair seemed to echo louder, a vulnerable little hum against the vast, oppressive silence of the garage. Just as Chloe passed the midway point, another sound joined the garage's sparse symphony. A scuff. The scrape of a cheap shoe on gritty concrete. It came from the unlit stairwell at the far end of the level. Frank's eyes snapped to the source of the noise. Two figures detached themselves from the deeper shadows near the concrete support pillars. They were indistinct, just silhouettes in the poor lighting, but their posture was unmistakable. It was the slouching, predatory saunter of men who thrived in places like this. They didn't walk with purpose. They drifted, like sharks sensing blood in the water. They weren't looking at Frank. They weren't looking at the man on the motorcycle. Their attention was locked entirely on the small, bright figure in the red shirt. They began to move, not directly toward her, but on a parallel course, their path designed to intercept her before she reached her vehicle. Frank's blood ran cold. This was not a random encounter. They had been waiting for her. He saw it all now. They had hidden in the stairwell, biding their time. The man on the motorcycle was a complication they hadn't expected, but they were undeterred. Chloe heard them too. She stopped again, her head whipping around. This time, the fear on her face was stark, visible even on Frank's grainy monitor. Her body went rigid. She was trapped. Her car was still 20 yards away. The elevators were 50 yards behind her. The two men were now fanning out, cutting off her angles. One of them let out a low chuckle that didn't carry to Frank's booth, but he saw the shape of it, the cruel curl of the man's lips. Frank's hand slammed down on the intercom button. "Central, this is Frank at P4. We have a situation. A female tenant. She's being cornered by two unidentified males. Looks hostile." The reply was a crackle of static and a calm, procedural voice. "Copy that, P4. We're dispatching someone. Can you maintain visual?" Frank didn't take his eyes off the scene. Maintaining visual, but you need to hurry. He knew how long it took. 5 minutes, maybe more. 5 minutes was an eternity down here. The two men were closer now, their pace quickening. Chloe was frozen, a deer in the headlights. She looked from the approaching men to the long, empty stretch of concrete leading to her car. There was no escape. Then she did something that made Frank's breath catch in his throat. She turned her wheelchair. Not toward her car. Not back toward the elevators. She turned it directly toward the silent man on the black motorcycle. It was a desperate, illogical move. Running from sharks into the jaws of a tiger. She propelled herself forward, her movements now sharp, deliberate, fueled by a terror that had burned away all hesitation. The two men slowed, confused by her change in direction. They watched as she rolled right up to the motorcycle, stopping so close her knee was almost touching the gleaming engine block. The man on the bike didn't flinch. He just watched her arrive, his expression unreadable. Frank could see her talking, but he couldn't hear the words. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. She was looking up at him, her face a mask of desperate appeal. The man remained perfectly still for a long moment. The entire garage seemed to hold its breath. The two stalkers had stopped completely, watching this bizarre interaction unfold. They were still confident, but a sliver of uncertainty had entered their posture. Then the man on the bike moved. He didn't speak. He simply swung his leg off the motorcycle and stood up. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than Frank had realized. He stood to his full height, and the air around him seemed to crackle. He looked down at Chloe, then he looked past her, his dark eyes sweeping over the two men who were now frozen near a concrete pillar. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and began to walk, his heavy boots making a slow, rhythmic thud, thud, thud on the floor. Chloe hesitated for a fraction of a second, then her hands flew to her wheels, and she fell into place beside him. He had become her escort, the unlikeliest protector she could have possibly found. Frank stared, mesmerized. The Korean Mafia boss, or whatever he was walking a paralyzed girl to her car. The two predators in the shadows watched, their easy confidence evaporating like mist. This had changed the equation completely. And Frank knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was far from over. The journey to her car was the longest 20 yards of Chloe's life. The man beside her moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, his pace perfectly matching the speed of her chair. He didn't look at her.
He didn't speak.
His gaze was fixed forward, but his awareness seemed to radiate outwards, a palpable field of energy that encompassed them both. Chloe could feel it, a strange sense of calm settling over her frantic heartbeat. The air around him was different, still, quiet, and absolutely solid. The sounds of the garage returned to her, no longer just a backdrop of terror, but distinct noises. The hum of the lights, the distant drip of water, the soft whir of her own wheels, and the sound of his boots. Thud, whir, thud, whir. It was a rhythm of protection, a strange and powerful drumbeat in the cavernous silence. She risked a glance at the men who had been following her. They were still there, loitering by the pillar, their predatory intent curdling into confusion and resentment. They hadn't fled. They were watching, waiting. Perhaps they thought this new man was just some stranger who would leave once she was at her car. Perhaps they thought he was bluffing. The thought sent a fresh spike of fear through her. What if he was? What if he just walked her to the door, nodded, and left her to fend for herself? She was an idiot. She had pinned her survival on a complete stranger, a man who looked more dangerous than the threat she was fleeing. His leather jacket creaked softly with each step. She could smell the faint, clean scent of it mixed with something else, something like cold night air and faint, expensive cologne. He was a wall of quiet intimidation, and she was rolling in his shadow. They reached her van, a dark blue vehicle with a hydraulic ramp. She fumbled in her satchel for her keys, her fingers clumsy and trembling. The metallic jingle was obscenely loud. She found the right key and pointed it at the van, pressing the button to unlock the doors and deploy the ramp. The mechanism whirred to life, the ramp descending with a low groan. It was a sound of safety, of escape. But the two men were starting to move again. They were separating, their intentions clear. They were going to flank the vehicle, trapping her between the van and them as soon as her protector left. The ramp finished its descent, clanking softly as it touched the concrete. This was the critical moment. Chloe looked up at the man, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." It was an inadequate phrase for what he had just done, but it was all she had. He didn't respond. He didn't turn to leave. Instead, he took 2 steps past her, positioning himself between her and the rest of the garage. He stood facing the approaching men, his back to her and the van. His stance was relaxed, almost casual, yet it was the most imposing thing Chloe had ever seen. He had become a human shield. The 2 men stopped dead in their tracks, about 30 feet away. The pretense was gone. Their faces, now more clearly visible in the light, were hard and cruel. One of them, a lanky man with stringy hair, called out, his voice a mocking sneer. "Hey, pal. This ain't your business. Just walk away." The man in the leather jacket didn't answer. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable object. The second man, shorter and stockier, took a menacing step forward. "You deaf?" he said. "Get lost. The lady owes us a little conversation." Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. She was positioned behind him, on the ramp, her hand on the controls to lift herself into the van, but she couldn't move. She was transfixed, caught in the terrifying stillness before the storm. The tall man finally moved his head, a slow turn to look at the stocky man who had spoken. He still said nothing. His silence was his weapon. It was unnerving, unnatural. It stripped them of their power, their taunts falling flat in the dead air. He was refusing to play their game. He was operating by a different set of rules entirely, and they had no idea what they were. The lanky one pulled something from his pocket. It wasn't a weapon, not yet. It was a phone. He held it up, smirking. "Maybe your boss wants to know you're interfering with company business," that was it. The mention of a boss. This wasn't random. They had been sent. This was targeted. The realization hit Chloe with the force of a physical blow. This was bigger and more terrifying than she could have imagined. The man in the leather jacket finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the cavernous space with absolute clarity. It was low, gravelly, and carried an accent she couldn't quite place. Leave, it was a single word. A command, not a request. The stocky man laughed, a short, ugly bark. Or what? You and what army? The man in the jacket didn't even look at him. His eyes were on the lanky one, the one with the phone. He took one slow step forward, then another. He moved with a liquid grace that was terrifying to behold. The two men tensed, shifting their weight, preparing for a fight. Frank, in his booth, had his phone in his hand, ready to dial 911 directly. Protocol be damned. He was witnessing the preamble to a brutal assault. But the violence never came. Not in the way he expected. The man stopped about 10 feet from them. He said something, not in English this time. The words were sharp, guttural, a string of syllables that sounded like stones striking rock. Chloe didn't understand them, but she understood the tone. It was a tone of pure, undiluted authority. It was the sound of a king addressing insects. The reaction from the two men was instantaneous and shocking. The smirk vanished from the lanky man's face, replaced by a mask of chalky white fear. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the concrete. The stocky man, who had been puffing out his chest a moment before, seemed to shrink, his shoulders caving in as if under an immense physical weight. They stared at the man in the jacket not as an obstacle, but as a ghost. As an impossibility. He spoke again, just 2 more words in that same foreign tongue. The lanky man flinched, as if he'd been struck. He bent down, snatched his phone, and started backing away, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't turn his back. He just retreated into the shadows, stumbling over his own feet. The stocky man followed a second later, practically tripping in his haste to escape. They vanished into the stairwell from which they had emerged, their retreat a complete and total rout. They hadn't been beaten. They had been dismissed. Frank stared at his monitor, his jaw hanging open.
No punches thrown.
No weapons drawn. Just a few words in a language he didn't recognize had neutralized a threat more effectively than a security team ever could. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution of power. The silence that descended upon the garage was profound. It was heavier, deeper than before. The two men were gone, but the echo of their fear remained. Chloe sat on the ramp of her van, her hands gripping her wheels so tightly her knuckles ached. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps. The man stood for a long moment, his back still to her, facing the empty space where the threat had been. He was ensuring they were truly gone. Finally, he turned around. His face, which had been a mask of cold command, softened almost imperceptibly as his eyes met hers. The sheer intensity was gone, replaced by a quiet, assessing calm. He walked back toward her, his boots making the only sound in the world. He stopped at the base of the ramp, looking up at her. For the first time, she saw his eyes clearly. They were dark, intelligent, and held a depth that spoke of a life lived far from the ordinary. They were not cruel eyes. They were weary, perhaps, but not cruel. "Are you all right?" he asked. His English was perfect, the accent just a subtle undercurrent now. Chloe could only nod, the words caught in her throat. She felt a tremor run through her arms and forced herself to release her death grip on her wheels. They were waiting for me. She managed to stammer out, the realization still fresh and terrifying. He nodded slowly. I know, of course he knew. He had understood the situation from the moment he first saw them. He had been waiting, too, though she couldn't be sure for what. "Thank you," she said again, and this time the words felt heavier, more meaningful. "You saved me." He gave a slight shake of his head, a gesture of dismissal. They were amateurs. He looked at her van, at the specialized controls visible through the open door, then back at her. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his expression. "Get in your car. Lock the doors." He wasn't leaving. He was waiting until she was secure. With trembling hands, Chloe operated the controls. The ramp lifted her smoothly into the driver's seat. She transferred from her chair, a motion she had performed thousands of times, but tonight it felt clumsy and slow. Once she was settled, she hit the button to retract the ramp and slide the door shut. The solid thunk of the lock engaging was the most reassuring sound she had ever heard. She looked through the window. He was still there. Alone, dark figures standing guard in the empty garage. He hadn't moved. He was waiting for her to start the engine. She put the key in the ignition and the engine turned over, its familiar rumble filling the small cabin of the van. The headlights flashed on, cutting two bright swaths through the gloom and illuminating him fully. He stood impassively in the glare, unmoving. He watched her, and she watched him, a silent exchange through the barrier of glass and steel. He had saved her life, or at least saved her from a fate she didn't want to imagine, and she didn't even know his name. On a sudden impulse, she pressed the button to lower her window. The cold air of the garage rushed in. "Wait," she called out. He inclined his head slightly, listening. "I don't know your name." He was silent for a beat, as if considering the request. "Minjun," he said finally. The name suited him. It was strong, solid. "I'm Chloe," she replied. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, so faint it was barely there. I know he knew her name. The thought sent a strange shiver down her spine, but it wasn't one of fear. It was something else entirely. Something closer to wonder. How did he know her name? Who was this man who appeared out of nowhere, commanded unseen armies with a few words, and stood guard over a stranger in a parking garage? "Those men," she started. "They said something about a boss." Minjun's expression became guarded again, the brief warmth vanishing. "It does not concern you, but it does," she insisted, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "They were after me. I need to know why." He took a step closer to her window, leaning down slightly. The proximity was overwhelming. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the single, faint scar that traced his left eyebrow. "Some people do not like to lose," he said, his voice low. "Your firm won the city development contract. The other bidder is a poor loser." It all clicked into place. The rival company, notorious for its aggressive tactics. She was just a graphic designer, but she had been the lead on the final presentation, the one that had sealed the deal. They weren't trying to rob her. They were trying to send a message. To intimidate her, to terrorize her company through her. And Minjun? Who was he in this equation? "And you?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Who are you?" He held her gaze for a long moment. "I am a business associate," he said, the slight hesitation telling her the term was woefully inadequate. "An associate of the people who believe contracts should be honored. And that women should be able to go to their cars without being harassed." He straightened up. "Go home, Chloe. You will not be bothered again." It wasn't a guess. It was a statement of fact. A promise. He had handled it. Whatever that meant. He started to turn away, back toward his motorcycle. "Wait," she said again, her voice stronger this time. "How can I thank you?" He paused, his back to her. "No thanks are necessary, but I want to," she insisted. He turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. "Next time," he said, "do not be so trusting of strangers in parking garages." There was a hint of dry humor in his tone. "Even me." And with that, he walked back to his bike, swung a leg over, and with a deafening roar, the engine exploded to life. He didn't look back again. He simply rode toward the exit ramp, his red taillight disappearing into the darkness, leaving Chloe alone in the sudden, echoing silence, her heart still pounding with a mixture of terror, relief, and a profound, baffling sense of connection to the dangerous man who had just become her unlikely guardian angel. Chloe sat in her van for 10 minutes, the engine humming, the heater blasting warm air that did little to chase the chill from her bones. The garage was empty again, just as it had been when Frank first started his shift. But it was different now. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of what had happened. The space held the imprint of Minjun's authority, of the two men's terror, of her own racing heart. She finally put the van in drive, her hands steady on the controls. As she passed the security booth, she saw Frank step out. He looked pale. He simply raised a hand, a gesture of solidarity, of witness. She nodded back, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The world outside the garage was shockingly normal. Cars passed under the streetlights, music drifted from a nearby bar, people walked along the sidewalks, blissfully unaware of the small war that had been fought and won in the concrete depths below. The next day at work was surreal. The office buzzed with the victory of the city contract. Her boss clapped her on the shoulder, congratulating her on the presentation. Her colleagues smiled and offered to buy her lunch. They spoke of the rival company's surprising and sudden withdrawal from all public bids that morning, citing internal restructuring. Chloe knew better. It wasn't restructuring. It was Min-jun. He had made a promise, and he had kept it. She went through the motions of her day, but her mind was elsewhere. It was in P4, replaying the events over and over. The cold fear, the desperate choice, the quiet power of his voice, the unexpected safety she felt in his presence. He was a paradox, a man who dealt in threats and shadows but used his power to protect. She thought about his warning. Do not be so trusting of strangers. But she had trusted him. Her instincts, screaming at her to flee from the two men, had somehow guided her toward him, recognizing a different kind of power, a different code. A week later, she found a small, unmarked envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of her van. Inside was a simple, high-end business card. It was black, with a single name embossed in silver, Min-jun. Below it was a phone number. No company, no title. Just a name and a number. It was an offering, a lifeline, a connection to the world of shadows she had briefly touched. She didn't know if she should use it. Calling him felt like stepping over a line, inviting a complexity into her life that she wasn't prepared for. But not calling him felt like cowardice. It felt like ignoring the most significant thing that had ever happened to her. That evening, sitting in her quiet apartment, the city lights twinkling outside her window, she made a decision. She wasn't the same woman who had rolled out of that elevator a week ago. That woman was afraid. This woman was curious. She was grateful. And she was no longer willing to let fear dictate her choices. She picked up her phone and dialed the number. It rang twice. A familiar, low voice answered. No greeting, just a quiet, yes? It's Chloe, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. There was a pause on the other end, and she could almost picture him. The stillness, the quiet consideration. Is everything all right? He asked. There was a genuine note of concern in his voice. Yes, she said. Everything is fine. Thanks to you. Another pause. I told you no thanks were necessary, I know, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. But I wasn't calling to thank you. I was calling to ask you a question. She could feel his surprise, even over the phone. What is it? That night, you knew my name. You knew about the contract. You were there waiting. You weren't there by accident, were you? The silence stretched, and she thought for a moment he might hang up. But then he spoke, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. No, he admitted. It was not an accident. I was there to make sure nothing happened. He had been there for her all along. Before she even knew she was in danger, her guardian was already in place. The thought was staggering, overwhelming. Why? She whispered. Let's just say, he said, and she could hear the hint of that rare, dry humor return. My associates and I have an investment in your company's success. And we prefer to protect our investments. It was a business answer, but it felt like something more. Well, Chloe said, feeling bold. If you want to protect your investment, you should probably see it up close. There's a coffee shop near my building. Tomorrow. 10 o'clock, she had thrown down a gauntlet. She had invited the tiger for coffee. The silence on the other end was long and deep. Then, for the first time, she heard it. A low, soft chuckle. 10 o'clock, he said. And then he hung up. Chloe lowered the phone, her heart doing a slow, steady drumbeat, not of fear, but of anticipation. She had stepped over the line. And she had a feeling she was never going back.